Good evening, I am Amadin Ogbewe. Now, the Niger coup and its aftermath has continued to raise questions and controversies about the future of democracy in Africa and West Africa, to be precise, with the removal of President Bazoum and the emergence of a military junta in the nation. We've seen a lot of face-offs between Niger and ECOWAS as regards the way forward and the issue of restoring a civilian rule at some point. But while that is still ongoing, we'll be taking a look now at the arguments for and against the issue of military and democratic rule. We'll be taking a look at what really is the best for the civilian out there of these nations where these takeovers occur and others where there's risk of the same happening. I'm joined tonight by Genesis Francis. He's a legal practitioner. He's just been able to do justice to the matter and to speak on the future of democracy in Africa. All right, Mr. Genesis, it's a pleasure to have you on Top Talk.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So let's start with, just a baseline. You've been following what's going on. I'd just like to get your thoughts on your take on how this whole matter has progressed so far. I'm talking about the Niger coup, of course.
Thank you for having me. The Niger situation has been talk of town, and of course, we need to look at what inspires coup in any setting. Generally, what brings about coup is a discontent by the military of such a sovereign state that the basic things they need for their operations are not made available. And a sense of entitlement comes in, where they begin to question the fact that, hey, we are here in the front line, putting our lives at risk. And these civilians, they call them bloody civilians, are there chilling in the presidency, and doing whatsoever they so wish to do with the state resources. When we are here staking our lives and we cannot get basic minimum resources needed to combat external forces, unwanted forces. So those questions and feeling of entitlement come in to propel the military most often times than not to take up a coup situation. In Niger's situation, reports have it that the reason they are putting out for taking up this coup situation is insecurity, inadequate security provision available. And we all know that they are seriously battling with the insurgency, the Boko Haram and the other militant group.
You're talking about Niger?
Yes, Niger.
Right.
There's Boko Haram in Niger. So the military in Niger are currently having a serious face-off with those militant groups. And apparently they are suffocating because resources that ought to be made available for them to fight those militia groups properly are not made available. That is the reason they are proffering for their military takeover.
All right, well, some persons proffer orders and conspiracies and speculations that one of the fights the military is having is as a result of the influence of the colonial masters still on, particularly on Francophone countries. Well, maybe we'll get to that later. Let's talk about Nigeria and ECOWAS. And I think in this situation, it might be hard to, separate the two, because Nigeria funds heavily the ECOWAS, and a lot of, when we mention ECOWAS, Nigeria makes the bulk of it in terms of contributions to making it viable. So let's talk about the reactions, the threat of sanctions, the ultimatums, and so on. People are saying that Niger is a sovereign nation, and no one has any right to make any comments or do anything about that. What's your take on that? To what extent does the sovereignty of a nation prevent aid when a civilian government has been toppled? Okay.
So to answer your question, I would rather start to look at it from the point of what makes a country sovereign. In case of any country, you draw your sovereignty by instituting a constitution I can't think of any country off my head now that is not governed by a constitution. The constitution becomes the ground norm that makes a country sovereign, that governs the affairs of a country. So when you have a situation where the military take over, one of the first things they do is to suspend the constitution. So they put online the sovereignty of that nation. But be that as it may, the Committee of Nations still recognizes that country as a distinct entity and sovereign entity. So what the Committee of Nations can do, the world is compartmentalized into regional integrations. Over the years, due to security concerns and economic benefits, the countries of the world have grouped themselves into regions. In our case, the West African region have the ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. In other climes, you have the EU, European Union, which is a body, a regional body that helps countries. The EU actually started as a security beneficial regional body to fight the Second World War, Then over time, when they were able to surmount the security challenge of war, they now migrated into becoming an economic beneficial body. Coming back to our context, the ideology of ECOWAS taking a stand to say, military, you cannot take over the operations of Niger, is considering the socio-economic impact of this military takeover on Niger and on the region called ECOWAS. So what has been happening in recent times, if you look at Niger, Niger is bordered by a number of countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria is bordering Niger, and a host of other countries. These two countries I have called, Mali and Burkina Faso, are currently or recently experienced coup and are currently under military rule. And these are the same countries that are giving motivation, and encouragement to Niger to stand their ground on their decision. ECOWAS, this whole military takeover does not favor ECOWAS, because once a military regime is in place, having suspended the constitution, that sovereign state does not respect any bilateral relations they initially had with Committee of Nations like ECOWAS. So before now, Niger is a signatory to the treaty, the ECOWAS treaty. Upon the suspension of the constitution by the takeover of this military junta, that bilateral benefit is threatened. So they no more answer to the Committee of Nations called ECOWAS. And in the long run, it affects the entire business environment when there is no law. And that's where the concept of rule of law comes to play. For a country, you have the rule of law governed by the constitution. For a Committee of Nations like the ECOWAS, you have the treaties and all coming to place to make sure that the interplay of laws and relations between nations are governed by sets of laws. Once there's a military takeover, that becomes difficult to manage. That is why ECOWAS is taking the stand to say, no, we cannot allow this, because in the long run, it will affect our bilateral relations in several respects, economic-wise, political-wise, and so many other fronts.
All right, that's interesting. But people keep, wondering, the legal aspect to this. Can ECOWAS say you have no right to do this and so on and so forth? Because, like you said, they suspend the constitution. So one might wonder, why does ECOWAS not just reach out a hand to the new government? I believe just very recently, President X, or should I call him former president? I don't know what language to use for him now. Well, President Bazoum has officially signed some resignation, and I think we saw him being walked out the other day. So the question is, they say, a coup or a successful coup, or let me put it this way, the punishment for coup, attempted coup, is death, is treason, But when the coup is successful, is another thing entirely. So people are wondering, just as we've seen some other countries, some of those countries who are also being taken over, show support for Niger, saying, we are with you, we are your allies. people are wondering, why is ECOWAS simply not accepting the new status quo?
Okay, so like I had started saying, when a coup plays out, the military comes up, they suspend the constitution, by implication suspending all other treaties they may have with Committee of Other Nations, and set up their own council. I'll use Nigeria, for example. In our recent history, when we had military regimes, what the military government did in time past in Nigeria, after suspending the Nigerian constitution, they set up a council called the Supreme Military Council. That council is governed by decrees and edicts, not the constitution. They, as military men, with the help of one or two civilian, because they don't even know how to couch laws, they'll just get one or two civilian experts to help codify one or two regulations and laws that will govern a sovereign nation, which most times is an expression of their whims and caprices. You can't call that the will of the people. Every constitution should be an expression of the will of the people. Before you even get to have a constitution, a proper constitution, there ought to be a referendum where a majority of the people in that country accent to say, we support the codification of this constitution as a law that should govern us. That's not what happens under a military era. What actually happens under a military era is they suspend that will of the people and install their own council or whatever edict or decree to govern the people. Is not from the people, it's from them. That's unacceptable for a sovereign state. Because the idea, don't forget, the primary idea of sovereignty of any state is the concept of saying a people can choose to be government of the people, from the people, and by the people. So the people come together and say, we want to be governed in this and this and this manner. Military takeovers don't allow the ordinary man that benefits to have those interplays of law. I wouldn't know if I have.
All right, that's fair enough. Well, let's talk about what you said about encouragement. You spoke about the neighboring countries doing same, and now Niger following suit, feeling like, if they can do it, we can do it too. What do you think is the issue here if it persists? We know about 6 countries already, and it's very weird to say in 2023 that countries are being taken over by the military. But that being said, what do you think this does, for other countries? And is there a way a particular country can escape coup based on, will I say, the craftiness of the democratic leaders, taking into account, or just as an aside, when President Tinubu came into office, he changed, those closest to him. Yeah, the service chiefs too. But then the military personnel and the security, those in charge of the villa and all that, they were also all changed. And even when we go back to history, it is believed that one of the reasons the FCT was created and moved from Lagos to here was to make it less accessible, more protection, to prevent military coups, so to speak. So that being said, this encouragement, what do you think it means for the future of democracy in Africa?
Yes, it's bad. It's a bad signal. It's a red flag, and it speaks to the original concept of state creation. All of these military takeovers are testamentary to the displeasure of the entity called the state. So if a functional state is doing what it ought to do, why would the military be interested? The default setting of a military man is combat. Most military men don't have the time and resources to engage with governance. But when you see this play, it's unlike the ordinary civilian who can stomach his displeasure as to how government is not doing things, there is a limit to how a military man can stomach such displeasure. That is what, and when they get to the war, they realize that, hey, we have been so empowered. We have the capacity to shut these guys and put things in place. And what most of them do, which has been the play out of events, is knock off the bad eggs, stabilize one or two things they feel is not going right, and institute an interim civilian rule, pending when the will of the people can now find expression a second time. So to answer your question, it's a bad precedent speaking negatively to the credibility of our leaders in Africa.
All right, so that being said,
Yes.
when we're hearing speculations and considerations about military intervention, what do you think that means? And again, back to the issue of sovereignty, is Nigeria or any other country, ECOWAS, allowed to use force to reinstate a democratic government in Niger, or would they be crossing a line? Are they meant to just observe and say nothing, or just as they've been doing with sanctions and so on? Should that be the limit, or do they have the rights?
So that's a trick question. It's a yes and no question.
Okay.
And it is yes to the extent that Nigeria and other West African countries are already feeling threatened by this event. One, like we've established, it encourages in-house rebellion from your own caucus. So if neighboring countries are succeeding, you begin to entertain the idea in your own setting. So you need to shut that notion. That's the first reason why I say yes. So second, you begin to contemplate the effect it will have on your own existence. Take, for example, the scenario between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has no business attacking Ukraine because Ukraine is a sovereign nation. But Ukraine engaged in activities that Russia felt this has consequence on my existence as a sovereign nation. So I must fight it. So it's from that angle that I can tell you ECOWAS can attack Niger to make sure that the excesses of the outcome of this event does not have rollover effects that would affect compliant nations under the ECOWAS body, and also breed this kind of nurturing. The no side of the question is there's a general presumption that as a sovereign nation, you reserve the right to be respected as a sovereign nation and be allowed to use internal mechanisms to regulate yourself. Every sovereign nation should be presumed to have in-house capacity to checkmate itself. And if you come to the environment of diplomacy, what plays out primarily is, first off, countries who are not in support of what you're doing as a sovereign nation will cut off bilateral ties with you. When they do that, you become stifled as a nation. And any smart nation would not want to be so isolated. There is hardly any country that survives on its own in the world right now. You need other countries to survive. So if you find yourself in a situation where you are being cut off via bilateral means, the ECOWAS measure of wanting to use military force is not to make this matter linger. Okay, because one of the things that happens when the matter linger is that, as we speak now, Niger is already experiencing bilateral ties, disadvantages. The US, I read on the news, the US is already refusing to send grants of over 100 million to Niger. The Central Bank of West Africa is already refusing to grant a bond worth $50 million, to Niger. All of those frustrations and severance of bilateral benefits that they ordinarily should get are being cut off. Ordinarily, this should put you in a tight position to say, it's not worth it. My people are going to lose their lives. These reliefs are meant to help my ordinary people. But of course, that's not how the military man thinks. He would rather withstand this kind of pressures and weather the storm and find allies. They're already finding allies. Yeah. So if they don't have allies and these bilateral ties are cut off, then maybe they will get to a stalemate and concede. But they're already building allies here and there. And the tendency is, if military force is not soon pressed on them, they could just weather the storm of these bilateral cutoffs and build new allies that will help them continue.
Yeah, that is interesting. We've seen even separatist groups or group in Nigeria, IPOB, have even pledged support. But let's talk about the advantages or disadvantages or the arguments for military and democratic rule. I don't know, I'm sure you've seen the video of a bunch of people in the stadium praising the military coup and the new military government. And a lot of people keep saying, is it so bad? Why don't we try it? The democracy, we've been suffering, we've been this and that. So the question is, what really, if we want to break it down, is the argument? Which would, at the end of the day, favor citizens more?
Okay, it's a beautiful question. So the entire concept of democracy, the system of government being practiced by Niger is semi-presidential system. They have a president, they have a prime minister, they have the judiciary, they have their legislature. Now, these are basic features of a democratic setting. Like I said earlier, if the government under the semi-presidential system were doing their work well, there's no basis for saying military is better. The people you saw at that stadium celebrating, two things I would say about them. One, they are frustrated from the bad governance of the people that found their way into power. But that brings the question, how did those people get to power? You know, I look at Niger and I marvel. This is a country that records one of the index of being one of the poorest nations in the world. They have a very high illiteracy rate. Now, when you have that as your landmark or as your identity, these people cheering, do they even know why they are cheering? Do they know the long effect of these military guys that have taken over? For them, this is room for fresh air. But they have no idea the ramifications the military take. So I'll just basically just help state the pros and cons of both sides of governance. For democracy, one of the things you enjoy in a healthy democratic setting is what we call the rule of law. Nobody is above the law. From the president to the least person is meant to govern and lead and live his life under the Constitution, which is the ground norm, and other laws set to regulate the lives of the people. There is separation of powers. No single body or individual reserves the cumulative power of the state. So like I just mentioned to you, in Niger, they even further split the executive into two. Some of the executive powers are performed by the president. Some other executive powers are performed by the prime minister. That's further delineation of roles. So nobody is too powerful to be regulated. They have the judiciary, you know. They also have their cabinet that helps with lawmaking. So when you look at all of these things, it puts you in the dimension that there's separation of power, and once there's separation of power, there's checks and balances. So that's what democracy helps you get.
Ideally.
You get ideal in an ideal situation. Then in military regime, like you just had, it's one body. They've already put up a body, National Council for something, I didn't get the name, but they've put up a body to be the body that regulates the entire Niger Republic right now. That body is going to exude executive powers, legislative powers, and most likely judiciary powers. That's too powerful to put in one body.
But this body, are
Yes.
they subject to, because you said it'll be ruled by decrees. Where does the decree come from?
They
make the decree?
This council they have now constituted is the council that will sit down and tell. They've already suspended the constitution. So what this council will now do is ask themselves, how do we want to govern this state? So from the panel of the few military officers seated there, if they are discretionary and gracious enough, they can add one or two civilians in that body and brainstorm. How do we want to govern the affairs of the state? So it is no more a law that came from the will of the people. It is now a law of the very few seated there, which in the long run could benefit a faction. Most likely it benefits the faction of the military leaders. So God help you. If your clan or your region of the country is not represented in that room, your interests are thrown to the gutters. So those are the dicey drama around such decrees and edicts under a military era. It is not a robust platform where everybody feels I have a sense of belonging in this state called a sovereign state that I am under, in this context, Niger Republic.
All right, so it's interesting. Like we pointed out about the stadium, we usually see a lot of Africans excited at the start of these schools, and then later on you start to hear a different story. But that being said, there's a belief that Francophone countries particularly are still indebted to their former colonial masters, the French, and so people say this is a source of agitation, particularly among the military. I heard the other day there's some sort of 85% to 15% sharing. There are speculations or there are things people claim to be true, but I'd like to get an understanding from you. Do you think there's any amount of external influence leading to what we are seeing here?
Okay, the honest truth from my point of view is that there's hardly any country in Africa that can hit its chest and say, I am sovereign in the full concept of sovereignty. You know, one way or the other, we are still victims of our past colonial masters. So the theories around Francophone speaking African countries still having a grip of France over them may be true. Of course, you won't see any written document where France still holds sway over these countries. But what do you expect? For Nigeria, for example, most of the laws that governs our operations today are drawn from the common law. Where is the common law from? It's from England. Who were our colonial masters? The English people. So I wouldn't be able to tell you that if I tell you that Francophone speaking African countries are totally sovereign and severed from France. I don't think I'm being fair to the reality, because having been so groomed by, of course, France, while severing ties, must have created good bilateral relations with such countries. So if France turns out to be the most beneficiary of the resources that are still coming from these African countries, with mutual agreements, international countries have bilateral relations and do businesses. I give you, you give me. I give you raw material, you give me finished products. That's business. So to say that France has one superpower over these countries may not be altogether true. It is a question of negotiation. So when France, because they've given independence to these countries, will not say, well, since we've given you independence, we don't want to have anything to do with you. It doesn't work that way in the business world. France will still do business with such countries if there are resources that can be beneficial to France. So the question remains, when France wants to do business with such countries, on what terms are those businesses done? Who are the representatives of those countries on the business conversation table? What bargains do they make? So if the bargains tilt in favor of France, how do you blame France? Is it France's fault that you don't have the capacity to make bargains that will favor you? Did anybody say, I'm waiting to hear one of these Francophone African countries saying, well, moving forward, we don't want to do business with France. We want to do business with China. And let's see if France will say, you cannot sever your ties from us. They can't do that because you're a sovereign nation. So if the countries choose to tie their allegiance or bilateral relations with France, that's their choice. So whether or not there are elements of truth as to say France still has a grip over this country remains in the hands of these countries. How well have they come up to terms with the fact that they are a sovereign nation and they reserve the right to determine who they relate with? As we speak, I confirm the fact that Francophone countries still do most of their bilateral relational businesses with France. That's the current reality. Whether that means that they cannot sever from France is totally yet to be found out until they engage the reality to say, oh, France, you have milked us for too long. Let's try some other persons.
That's fair enough,
Yes.
Even with the issue of the currency being used across these countries. But so let's just end it on this note. I'd like to get your advice now, your thoughts on restoring democracy, sustaining it.
Okay.
Yes. How can we go about that so that we don't keep seeing more coups popping up every other day? What's the advice to those in power now, the democracy, that those still lucky enough, have to use that word, to have their system in place?
Yes.
What's your advice to them? What are the pitfalls they should avoid?
Thank you. The truth of the matter is, this is a wake-up call for all democratically elected governments in Africa and probably anywhere in the world, the time and days where people die in silence is passing by. You know, part of why we've not had military takeovers in recent times is because the United States have put a firm foot to say it has to be democracy. And they are putting that strong foot because they've seen the dividends of democracy. Unfortunately for us, sir, in our part of the world, I'm sorry to say, we are not yet seeing, or maybe we are seeing a little, but we are not seeing it in the magnitude we desire to see, the dividends of democracy. So it's a clarion call for our leaders. Guys, you need to sit up. Sit up because the entire concept of a sovereign state is to protect lives and properties and to provide basic amenities to help your citizenry to live, to thrive, to grow, to become better. Once all of these basic elements are missing, for crying out loud, people will revolt. All of the agitations we're getting from Biafra, from all of these bodies, they are a cry to say, we don't feel carried along. So it's for the center, the government at the center, to say, how do we become an inclusive government? How do we carry everybody along and help foster that integration and secure lives? Once those questions are not properly dealt with and people don't have that sense of belonging, you'll probably still be having this kind of agitations. I don't pray that Nigeria ever finds reason to come around the entertaining. Well, the leaders are smart to check who are the head, because military takeovers happen by champions. Somebody has to champion it. And of course, our leaders were smart to make sure that whoever could be at that influential state is probably taken off. And whoever is at such strategic place is a loyalist or somebody who will not be a conformist to such vices. So, but we shouldn't take that for a ride. We should sit up and do what the state was created to do.
All right.
Fend for the people.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Francis. It's been a pleasure. It's good to have you. Hopefully, we get to see more of this, and we get to see those dividends, like you said. I think that's the biggest plus to democracy. When people begin to see that, there won't be any need or any agitations for more. So thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, sir.